Hey guys, it's Graham. Welcome back to Trucker Man Reads. First video back from Thanksgiving break. I am fighting a major carbohydrate hangover right now, and I'm, of course, driving to work in the sleet. So, why not talk about a book? Earlier this year, I picked up a copy. Well, back up. I got Switchblade Shorties by Ed Piskor, which is this big hardcover illustrated book. There's a story, and then there's a story behind the story. I'm going to tell you about the book, and then I'm going to tell you about how I came to get it. I want you to know about the book first. So, Switchblade Shorties, Ed Piskor, he's a very accomplished illustrator, comic book artist. Famously, he went to the Kubert School in New Jersey, and before the term was over, the instructors, they had some integrity in this, and they went to him and said, like, you probably shouldn't, pay for the full degree here or whatever, because there's nothing else we can teach you. You're already, beyond what we can do for you. Just go out there and go to work and make comics. And so he spent the next 2 decades doing just that. He went on to do some X-Men stuff, along with doing a whole different slate of things. He was just able to constantly work in the arts and in illustration. He did a couple of self-published projects, or projects that he set out to do himself, and this one was one of them, and it was the last project that he would ever do. The title doesn't give you a complete sense of what it is. If I were to describe this book, I would say if you were to take Peanuts and South Park and mash them together and drop them in the early 90s with a soft R rating, that would do it. So the main characters, there are 5 girls. There's Pinky, Foster, Sheena. I'm blanking on the other 2. They've all got really distinct personalities, and they're drawn very differently. They're 5 girls in an elementary school or middle school, roughly around that age. They're all best friends living in Pittsburgh in the early 90s. Sometimes you get a bit of a late 80s vibe, but when the book plays out, there's there are references to like Power Rangers and X-Files. It's like, all right, this is a 90s thing. And they just kind of go around and get into trouble or have adventures together, and then there's a through line where one of the girls has a neighbor boy, a friend named Petey, who's missing. They're not sure what happened to him. They go looking for him in the trailer park, and they find a guy who caught an alien somehow, and they make friends with the alien. And then later on, they discover that there's a werewolf in their town in Steel Valley, in Pittsburgh. And eventually the werewolf and the alien cross paths, and it's the way that I'm describing it is probably not doing it justice, but it's good, it's charming, it's endearing, and it resists summarization beyond talking about what the theme and the atmosphere and certain individual beats of it are. The general tenor of the story is that all these girls are just their best friends. They live kind of in different classes and in different groups, but their friendship transcends all of those things. One of the girls is rich. Her dad's the mayor. Another girl, her parents are split up. Her dad works for the FBI. One girl lives in squalor, and her mom's a stripper, and the little girl smokes, and she has to constantly babysit, and she picks up things from her mom's boyfriends, bits of esoteric worldly knowledge beyond her years that end up becoming valuable for the quests that they undertake as friends. I say Peanuts because it's about kids dealing with adult topics as they have childish adventures. I say South Park because there's an edge to it, but in the edge, it doesn't go beyond a certain threshold. Like these kids are rough, but they're not out there dropping super extra hard profanity. Like they will literally say F you, like EFFU, or call somebody a whore, HOOR. It's not overdone to the point where it's like, okay, you're abusing the joke and we know what you're really trying to say, but it's there just enough to show that, for 8-year-olds or however old these kids are, they've got teeth. I'm sure it mentioned at some point, where these kids are on the age scale. But as the whole story played out, and you get to the last couple of arcs of it, and you get some colored pages, um, you could tell that he had started the story at one point, and he was kind of developing it as he went. He was dating the artwork at the bottom. It was looks like he started it in late 22 or early 23, and he had completed it, and it was ready to ride in 2024. And just as I read it, I could tell that this is a guy who was really, like, he was invested in what he was doing. And you can paint that one of two ways. Like, yeah, of course, every artist ought to really believe that what they're making is great. He wasn't just making something to get it out of the way and say, hey, look, I made this, people should buy it and read it. There was some soul to it, and I think that's what gave it the charm as it went along, even when it went in directions that I as a creator wouldn't have gone, or crossed certain thresholds. It was like, well, I wouldn't write this about a kid's comic. Well, he wasn't marketing it to kids. Like, this was obviously very much for a grown-up audience, and in a sense, it felt like he might have been kind of writing a version of his own childhood. Not that his childhood necessarily went that way, but he was from Pittsburgh, and so that would have come through in his use of the setting. This is where we get to the story behind the story. I had never heard of Ed Piskor until I started following Zach on YouTube. Ed Piskor and Jim Rugg ran a YouTube channel called Cartoonist Kayfabe, and I watched a couple of episodes back in the day, and I just felt like completely out of my depth, like a fish out of water. It felt like this was a show for comic fans who had been comic fans for 30 years and knew names and new eras and had read all the issues, and it was these guys who were the diehard long-term fans going back and like reminiscing as they chronicled the history of comics. That right there made it valuable to me as a viewer, but at the same time, I felt like, man, I feel like there's a lot of context that I need for whatever subject they're talking about, or who this person was that they mentioned, or whatever. But they ran Cartoonist Kayfabe for years, and Zach was a big fan of that, and he would listen to their shows, and he would talk about it and work it into his videos, which were shorter and a little bit more surface level, which I found easier to access from the outside. As I've said before, I never had a pull file at a comic book store until about 2 years ago. If I saw a comic, usually in the form of a trade paperback or a graphic novel that looked interesting, I'd pick it up and read it. I would cycle it in as a supplement to my regular stuff, but I was never reading monthlies. It was just a habit that I never picked up, even if I was peripherally aware of these characters and their arcs and their stories. So, when my family, a bunch of normies, went to see comic book movies, I could explain some basics and some behind-the-scenes stuff, but there was always some nerd out there, and I say that completely lovingly, who knew more about mainstream comic book stuff than I did. So that's about where I was on that threshold. April of 2024 came along, and there are things that I do know and things that I don't know, and the things that I don't know about what happened to Ed Piskor grossly outweigh the things that I do know, to the extent that I don't want to really offer any opinion or analysis or summary of it. Suffice it to say that he was targeted by a cancellation mob. They made his life a living hell, and after a week of that, including them attacking anybody who associated with him, and they went after Jim Rugg, who has a family, He had to tell Ed, he's like, I've got to consider this, and apparently Ed understood that, but he effectively lost cartoonist kayfabe as part of this process. Um, it seemed like he was losing everything that he had spent the last 20 years doing in comics because of this cancellation attempt. And as a result, he took his own life. And Zach covered that. He has his opinions on that. I'm not going to restate them here. The videos are still up on his channel as he talks about how that whole thing went down. And obviously, I think that it's tragic. About a month or two after it happened, Ed's siblings went on to Perch's show and had an interview with Comics by Perch. And they didn't get into any of the particulars about that. They talked about their memories with their brother and their son, and his life and his legacy as an artist, and how he got basically graduated early out of the Kubert School because of his prodigious talent at a young age, and his involvement with his family, how they'd always get together and he was always drawing and telling stories with his nieces and nephews and stuff, and like that was just his life. If you've ever lost a sibling, let me just say that I don't recommend it. And his sister especially, it seems like this was her way of working through that process, was taking on the work of getting her brother's last book out. Not just her, but the family, but I know it was his sister who kind of took point on also managing the social media side of things, running the Kickstarter campaign for Switchblade Shorties, and you're posting pictures of him on Instagram and stuff. And so I decided last summer, I was like, all right, well, I'll pull the trigger on backing this thing. I think I'd like to check out what this book was from Ed Piskor, and then it showed up this year on my birthday, no less. So I grabbed it, I set it on my shelf, and to be honest, I was hesitant to read it for a while, just because, and even after I read it, I was hesitant to review it, because it's like, how would I do a review justice, for one thing? How would I talk about it without talking about him? And I don't think that it would be fair or right necessarily to talk about this book without talking about him, how it came to be, and what happened to him, and how he met his end. And I also didn't want to go the other direction and have what might unfairly be called the Heath Ledger effect, where his final performance was in The Dark Knight as the Joker, and he did a great job, but I think people's response to it, for better or worse, fairly or not, was impacted by the fact that he died young, and how he died. I'm not going to go say that this was a perfect, flawless swan song or anything, just because it was the last thing that Ed Piskor did. But I will say that, even though, and you guys know my stance on content, there was violence, there was blood and guts in this book, and situations that you shouldn't be writing kids into. But unfortunately, we know about the world that we live in, and sometimes kids are in those situations. There wasn't any essay or anything like that in the book. It was just, like I said, one of the girls, her mom is a stripper. It is what it is. Even despite some of the issues that I might have had with the content, the charm and the earnestness and the skill that went into this book won me over. And if this was my first real deep dive and immersion into the talent of Ed Piskor, I think it was a great one. Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, I'd probably put it on Tier 2. I don't know that I'll ever pick this up and read it again. I don't know necessarily if I'll hold on to it. I might eBay it down the road. I think for now it can keep sitting on my shelf, and I'll decide how I feel about it later. It was beautifully well done. I thought especially the forewords and the afterwards did a lot to really convey how important he was to his family, and sharing the memoria of him there at the end was touching and impactful. I will say that the final admonition that the Kubert School instructors gave to Ed Piskor and that he always gave to his audience on Cartoonist Kayfabe, it hits me, and it moves me to want to do something. He was always saying, read more comics, buy more comics, make more comics. And obviously, as a writer and illustrator, like, I've toyed with the idea of, I could make a comic at some point, and I think I'm definitely going to do that now. I need to figure out the writing side of it. Obviously, like, just because I'm good at novels doesn't mean that I'm immediately going to be good at comic scripts. And there's a visual language and pacing to comics that I'm unfamiliar with on the creation side of it. I'm good at reading it. I'm not necessarily picking up on all of the things that are necessary for telling the story correctly in a visual format. So I'd have to figure that out. But I think I am going to tackle it. I've got a short story that was in an anthology last year that the rights have reverted to me, and I think I'm going to adapt it and turn it into a graphic novel at some point. It'll work very well visually. So I'll try that. After reading this, and after the reading that I've done about Ed Piskor's life, and some more of the episodes of Kayfabe that I've watched over this last year, it's definitely an admonition that I want to heed, to not only keep finding good comics and reading comics, but I've got the skills. I'll need to fine tune them, but I think I should put in the effort to make a comic too. Anyway, I'll close by echoing the point that Ed's family put at the end of the book. If you're struggling with mental health, reach out. I think 988 is the suicide hotline, or suicide assistance, mental health assistance line. No defeat is permanent, and whatever you're going through, it can be passing. And always remember the ones that love you, because they're the ones that are going to need you to hang behind. Drive safe. See you out there.